Today, we are diving into one of the world's oldest and most continuously used writing systems, Chinese characters. For thousands of years, figuring out where they came from was a total mystery, something wrapped up in incredible legends. But believe it or not, thanks to a sick scholar and some old bones, we now have the real story.
So let's just start with the biggest question of all. How do you actually do it? How do you take a picture of something you see, like a tree or the sun, and turn it into a symbol that everybody agrees means that exact thing? That's the huge creative puzzle at the very heart of any written language. For most of Chinese history, the answer to that question wasn't found by digging in the dirt. Nope, it was found in myths. And these weren't just little campfire stories. These were epic tales of sage emperors, mystical symbols, and this idea of divine inspiration, all trying to explain the miracle of writing.
So, where did these incredible characters really come from? Well, before we get to the science and the archaeology, we've got to understand the stories people told each other for centuries. Let's start right there by exploring the legendary answers to this great origin mystery.
Ancient Chinese scholars basically came up with three main theories. The first one connects writing to these mystical symbols called the 8 trigrams, or the bagua. The second one suggests it all grew out of a really simple memory trick, just tying knots in ropes. And the third one, the most famous of all, gives all the credit to one legendary hero, the sage Kangji.
All right, let's unpack these ancient ideas. We're going to look at each one, from sacred symbols to simple knots, and really see the clever ways our ancestors tried to explain what seemed, well, unexplainable. Okay, so the first theory points to the bagua, these 8 symbols supposedly created by the legendary ruler Fuxi. And you gotta admit, when you look at this slide, it's pretty compelling. On the left, you've got the trigram for water. Now turn it 90 degrees, and wow, it looks almost identical to the ancient character for water on the right. But here's the catch. It's just a crazy coincidence. The other 7 trigrams, they look nothing like their characters. So a cool idea, but not our answer.
Next up is the idea that writing came from tying knots, or jiesheng, and this was a real thing in a lot of ancient cultures. You tie knots in a rope to remember stuff, a big knot for a big event, a small knot for a small task. But you see the problem, right? A knot can remind you that you need to remember something, but it can't tell you what it is you're supposed to remember. It's missing the specific details, which is kind of the whole point of writing. And that brings us to the most famous legend of them all, the story of Kangji. He was supposedly the official historian for the mythical Yellow Emperor. And the legend says he was this incredible sage with, get this, 4 eyes. This apparently allowed him to see all the hidden patterns in the universe. So he'd study the tracks of birds and animals, the shadows cast by trees, and he used all of that to create a whole system of symbols.
And the logic the legend gives him is just brilliant. Okay, so how do you write private? First, he draws an enclosure, si, like something walled off for me. Then, to be more specific, he adds the symbol for green, he, creating the character si for private property. Now for public, this is genius. He took the symbol for the number 8, ba, which also meant to divide. He put that symbol over the one for private. So what happens when you divide up what is private for everyone to share? Well, that becomes public, or gong. I mean, that is just an incredibly elegant way to think. So let's be real for a second. Was there actually one guy named Kangji who invented thousands of characters all by himself? Almost certainly not. The philosopher Shunzi probably hit the nail on the head here. He said lots of people were making up symbols. Kangji's real genius, and the reason we remember his name, is that he was probably the one who organized them all, who standardized everything into one unified system. He wasn't the sole inventor, he was the great editor. All right, so let's leave the world of myth and legend behind and turn to what we've actually found. The true story of Chinese characters wasn't one guy having a brilliant idea. It was a slow, gradual evolution that started with simple drawings. Yeah, the real answers started showing up in the dirt. Archaeologists were digging at these Neolithic sites, places like Dawenkou and Bonpo, and they found pieces of pottery, over 6,000 years old. And scratched right onto those pieces were symbols, a sun over a mountain, a plant, an axe, that are so clearly the great-great-grandparents of the very first Chinese characters. And this slide just shows that process perfectly. On the left, you've got these simple but still pretty realistic drawings of a fish, a bird, and a deer that were found on ancient stuff. Then on the right, you see their characters in the earliest Chinese writing we know of.
The connection is just, it's undeniable. You can literally see the picture becoming more abstract, more symbolic, until boom, it's not just a picture anymore, it's a word. Now, all of his evolution eventually led to the first mature, systematic, and verifiable Chinese script. But the story of how we rediscovered it, it's one of the most incredible tales in archaeology. And it all starts with a trip to the pharmacy.
So, picture this. The year is 1899. In Beijing, a really high-ranking scholar and expert in antiquities named Wang Yirong comes down with malaria, and his doctor prescribes him a traditional remedy. One of the things in his medicine is an ingredient called dragon bones. Now, these were really just fossilized animal bones that would be ground up into a powder. But Wang Yirong wasn't just any scholar. His specialty was ancient inscriptions on bronze artifacts. So as he's looking at these bones before they get crushed, he notices something. There are carvings on them. Now, to anyone else, they would have just looked like random scratches. But to Wang Yirong, with his trained eye, he instantly recognized it as a form of writing, but one that was way older than anything he had ever seen before. He immediately sent his servant out to buy every single dragon bone he could find in that pharmacy. What he had just stumbled upon would change history. It was Oracle Bone Script. This was the writing of the long-lost Shang dynasty, a civilization that, up until that point, a lot of people thought was purely mythical. And these bones, they were the royal archives, and they were used for one very specific purpose: telling the future. So here's how it worked. The Shang king or his fortune tellers would take a turtle shell, usually the flat bottom part, or the shoulder blade of an ox, and they would carve a question into it. Then they'd take a hot poker and apply it to these little pits they had drilled, which would cause the bone to crack. The diviner would then read the pattern of the cracks to get an answer from the spirits. But, and this is the really cool part, they didn't just ask the question and read the cracks. Incredibly, they recorded the entire process right there on the bone itself. And, in doing so, they created the earliest structured stories in Chinese history. A complete inscription was like a tiny little lab report with 4 clear sections. First, you had the preface, the qianxi, qianju, which set the scene with the date and the diviner's name. Second was the charge, or mingxi, which was the actual question, like, is it going to rain tomorrow? Third was the prognostication, the chunxi, where the king gave his interpretation of the cracks. And finally, you had the verification, or yanxi, where a scribe would come back later and record what actually went down. And this part is just amazing to me. The Shang were incredibly honest record keepers. If the king predicted rain, but it was sunny all day, the verification would note that the prediction was wrong. They actually valued the historical record more than they valued being right. So, from mythical sages watching bird tracks, to ancient artists drawing on pottery, to Shang dynasty kings asking the spirits questions on turtle shells, the story of Chinese characters is really the story of turning pictures into ideas. And even after 3,000 years of change, that direct visual connection between the image and the meaning is still right there, if you know how to look for it. Which leaves us with one final thought. You know, we all know that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So what does that make a word that, at its very soul, is still a picture? What is that worth?